what if I said to you, can you hear the voices? Can you hear the voices? You'd probably think, he's lost it. He's deluded. But if I were to pull out a smartphone, click on my conferencing app, turn on the speakerphone, enter the meeting, you would hear the voices of my project members from Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Italy, Germany, Portugal, and America. You would hear the voices. So you need an instrument to hear the inaudible. You need an instrument to see the invisible. And that's where we have this creative tension between science and that which lies outside of science. And we're always pushing the edges a little. So can you imagine back in the 1960s when Dorothy McLean said, I am communicating with the overlighting spirits of plants? What do you think people said then? She's out to lunch? Or were the people that said, I'm willing to suspend disbelief just for a while and just look at the results? And Findhorn has so beautifully expressed this relationship with nature. It's so well documented and so well known that we don't need to go into that now. But the thing is, Dorothy didn't use a smartphone to contact the overlighting spirits of the plants. She used the instrument of self. And that's what I want to focus on. It's one thing to have interspecies communication, but how do you do the communication? I call it the instrument of self. And like my smartphone, it continually needs to be upgraded. A new operating system, whatever. But it can be upgraded. And one of the things that we know is that we have this great sensitivity. We can feel things. We can even have second sight. Here in Scotland, as we know, it's quite common to talk about second sight. We talk about intuition and telepathy, and there's been research done on telepathy. I'm thinking of a good friend of mine, Willis Harmon, who was a professor at Stanford University, who was part of the experiments way back when, in the 50s and 60s, that SRI did, the Stanford Research Institute. And then later on, Willis, and Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, went on to found the Institute of Noetic Science. But back in those times, what they did was have this exchange between the astronauts in space and a ground team, where they had cards with printed symbols on, and the ground crew would pick a symbol, say it was a pentagram or a circle, a triangle, and they would focus on it. And the astronauts in space would attempt to guess. And they found that with intentional sending and intentional receiving, there's a higher rate of probability of guessing the correct answer. And so it's how do we fine-tune our sensitivity? And really, the first step is not just to open the mind, but it's to open the heart. Because through love, we come into resonant relationship with something. So the law of resonance says, if I am in resonance with you, I am you. We are one. Distance collapses. Many years ago, I lived in Sweden, and in the 1970s, a group of us from Stockholm decided we'd had enough of the city, and we were part of what was called the Green Wave, in Swedish Gröna vågen, and we moved from the cities into the countryside. And we found in the west of Sweden, up next to the Norwegian border, an old man who was practicing natural farming that had been handed down for generations, for over 500 years in a particular valley, and he was the last person to know this. And so we decided to go and spend 2 years with him. His name was Anders Björnsson, and he lived in Värmland, which is right up in the west of Sweden, close to the Norwegian border. And when we arrived, Anders says, take off your shoes, go walk on the soil. You've been walking on the streets of Stockholm too long. You need to be in magnetic rapport with the earth. And so we did that. And then Anders said to us, I'm a doubting Thomas. Theory comes after practice. So I want you to be absolutely open to observing what's happening. Get rid of all your theories and just observe through nature what actually is happening. And he didn't allow us to send the soil to a lab to get it tested. He said, if you send it, it will tell you what ingredients it has, but it won't tell you the livingness of the soil. That you tell by looking at what's growing in the soil. And he pointed to a clump of horsetail and said, there's silica in that soil because the horsetail's growing. And so what Anders did was sensitize me. And through this sensitization, I started to have these deeper, more spiritual experiences in nature. And I thought, I'd like to test out a hypothesis. I believe that a positive attitude and love has an effect on the growth of plants. So I talked to Anders and we agreed to set up an experiment. I took a piece of land, I divided it in half, and I sat potatoes, identical, blue mandel, or blå mandel, which is blue almond potatoes in Sweden. And I put one half where I absolutely ignored them. I turned my back on them. The other half, I loved them, I talked to them, I stroked them magnetically. I just thought they were wonderful. And at the end of about 3 months, we compared the two. And the ones that I'd turned my back on looked depleted. They didn't have much life. They looked a little sad. Now, that may be a human projection, but they looked a little sad. The ones that I'd given all the attention to were not only bigger, they looked stronger, the leaves were greener. They'd been able to fix the nitrogen. And the ultimate test, of course, is the taste test. And they passed the taste test with flying colors. So Anders and I debriefed, and we concluded that based on our observations, it is okay to say that positive thinking, loving thoughts, add to the vitality of all life, particularly the potatoes. And so I think what we're realizing now is that it's our attitude. We can condition the environment by how we think and how we feel. I came to Findhorn because my experiences in Findhorn deepened my relationship with nature, and I felt very alone. I didn't know who else was having these experiences. And then when I read about Findhorn, I thought, okay, there's some others like it. So I arrived, and Findhorn has amazing people coming through it. You're part of it. One of them was Cleve Baxter, who I hosted for a week. He's the person referred to in The Secret Life of Plants who did the experiments with the philodendrons. He wanted to see if human emotion and human thought could affect plants. So he hooked up, because he was a former FBI agent, he hooked up the philodendron to a lie detector. And he went into another room in the building and he thought a thought. And this thought was, I'm going to burn your leaf with a cigarette. And immediately at the same time, there was a reaction. There was a definite reaction and a spike. And they repeated this experiment many times, so it was statistically valid. And Cleve proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that everything we think and transmit and send out from our minds and our hearts has an effect on our environment. And that was for me, that was a big eye-opener, because it meant if I'm going to work, for instance, on pollution, I don't just go cleaning the environment outside. I've got to look at my inside and say, what is it in me that's polluting? My negative thoughts, my sense of separation, or whatever it is. Going back to the instrument of self, there are many people who limit themselves. And I bumped into a situation in Seattle where I worked for the Boeing Company. I was a senior organization development consultant for 16 years. And one day we were sent to a training program because we were wanting to see what this new training looked like. It was a communications program we wanted to bring into the company. And so I attended the course. And the instructor started out by saying, we only have 5 senses. Everything else is illusion, it's unreal. And I thought, that's very interesting. So I put my hand up. What about the 6th sense? What about intuition? Can't be proven. And I said, do you mind if I tell you a story? And he said, okay. So here's the story I told him. It was in 1985, and I was on the island of Iona at a conference. And I was sitting down at the dinner table when all of a sudden I got this incredibly vivid experience, this impression of my father calling me with great urgency. It was one of those wake-up calls. And I said, excuse me, I've got to leave and make a phone call. So I phoned home, and my mother picked up the phone and said, thank God you called. We didn't know where you were. Your father's just collapsed. He's in the hospital. The doctors don't think he has long to live. So I went back to the table and said, guess what? And the person next to me was Jerry Jampolsky, who's the author of Love is Letting Go of Fear. And he said, Michael, you've got to go be with your father. You've got to have that last conversation to tell him you love him, to forgive him, so he can be released. And then the woman to my left said, oh, you can take my rental car. You can take it. I'll cover the bill. So I took off. I got down to the south of England, to the hospital in Surrey, just in time. I spent a deep, deep conversational time with my father. I completed. And 2 hours later, he died in my arms. I kissed him, and I placed a rose on his chest. And I thought, if I hadn't been able to pick up his signal, register it, and respond, I would never have been complete with my father. And so I explained that to the instructor. And he was a little quiet, and he said, I'll make an exception this time, and I'll allow you to have a 6th sense. So we talk about 6th sense. There are more levels, more refined levels of sensitivity beyond the 6th sense. And that's what we're developing with the instrument of self. And then we come back to the Findhorn experiment. About 200 meters from where we are now was the original Findhorn garden where it all started. This is the interspecies communication. And we know the story. Dorothy got in touch with the overlighting spirit of the plants we call devas, or the angelic beings, and they're like the great architects that hold the pattern. And then they have their workers, the elementals, the nature forces, who are like the contractors. So you've got the architect, you've got the contractors, and then you've got the humans who've got to put it all together. And that experiment was not just about growing big vegetables. That experiment in interspecies communication was to say that we need to have that connection with the whole spectrum of life, whatever we do. Whether it's the arts, whether it's finance, whatever, we need to be in that relationship. So one of the things I'm looking at is, how do we refine this instrument of self so we can be better receivers and better transmitters? And I go back to an open and loving heart, a clear and pure mind. And I remember Peter talking about the experience that I had in his life of promptings. Peter would say, when you get a prompting, when you get an intuitive prompting, you've got to act on it immediately. You don't say, no, that's nothing. And so it's sensitizing yourself to the signals. This room is full of signals. The whole universe is full of signals. In fact, life talks to itself constantly. Life listens to itself constantly. So we're here together to do something at Findhorn. We've been tasked with demonstrating that spirit can actually show up in a dense form, that you can feel the magic when you build a hall like this. And I had the joy and the privilege of being part of the building of this hall I put in a couple of stones on the side, I wheeled some wheelbarrows full of concrete here, and I did other things like the rest of us, carried the beams up from the delivery to the hall. It was an incredibly creative time. But this hall symbolizes our ability to co-create with nature. And what our task is now as a civilization is to co-create with the full spectrum of life to give birth to a future that is more splendid than the one today, that has more justice in it, has more love in it. All the things that we know are the next level, the next stage of evolution. So it's not just about developing the individual instrument of self. We have to develop the collective instrument of self. And this is the field of receptivity. There's something called the science of impression that says thoughts need somewhere to land. So if we have a fertile mind and an open heart, we can actually be like a chalice and receive the ideas that come from the cosmos, the seeds that contain the full promise of who we are. And so in places like this, we have to develop this instrument of self so that we can be a place of demonstration and show that vision can actually go through into action, and that a new world can be born out of our dreams and out of our hands and feet and the sweat of our daily work. And there's a wonderful childhood verse that I'm always reminded of. And it says, God sleeps in the stones, dreams in the plants, stirs in the animals, and awakens in humanity. We need to not only awake, we have to co-create. And those are only 4 of the kingdoms: mineral, plant, animal, human. I thought a spectrum had 7. I thought a scale of music had 7 notes, 7 colors. What about the remaining 3 kingdoms? What about the remaining 3 levels that we need to penetrate? And that's it. We're getting deeper into spirit so that we can bring it into matter and create a world that is brighter and better for all people. So the importance of what we're doing here and what you're doing wherever you live in the world is that the interspecies communication is not a fantasy. It is the only way, it is the bedrock for this new civilization. Because without it, we're just gonna think about our human needs. We're gonna be specious in our thinking. So interspecies communication is a way of broadening our outlook and saying, everything I do has to serve the whole. Not just the whole of humanity, but the whole spectrum of life. And the law of resonance says, if I love something, I am so close to it. Closer than hands and feet, nearer than breathing. So it's time to wake up. Time to wake up to the splendor and glory of who we are, and time to wake up to the instrument of self individually, but more importantly, collectively, because when the instrument of self is activated collectively, there is nothing that can stop the birth of a brighter future. Thank you.